Good morning, everyone. I hope you've all had a coffee because I'm going to kick us off with a presentation on strategic planning frameworks. At least we're getting out of the way early, and then the rest of the day there'll be some really good ecological research to talk about. So my name's Claire Feniuk. I manage the CEC's research strategy, and since the start of this year, I've been leading our work on a 12-month pilot project focused on climate adaptation in the Foothill forests of the Otways. The Resilient Forest project is delivered through a partnership between the Conservation Ecology Centre, DECA, and Maar Aboriginal Corporation, EMAC. And before I start, I want to gratefully acknowledge the Gadabana, Gulidjan and Kirai-Warung peoples of the Maar Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the forest country on which this project is focused. This project is all about adapting to change through time, and there's so much that we can learn from the knowledge and understanding of traditional owners who have managed this land for tens of thousands of years. And this project is all about working together. Our aim is to bring together traditional ecological knowledge and obligations to country, alongside community insights and perspectives with Western science, so ecology and climate change, and integrating these things into a slightly nerdy strategic planning framework called Adaptation Pathways. And there'll be more on that later. But first, why are we doing this work here and why now? Well, let's start with where here is. This project is focused on the Foothill forests of the Otways, which is a broad category of low elevation mixed eucalypt forest that includes a range of EVCs that you can see on the map here. But in less technical terms, it's basically the slightly lower, drier bits that surround the tall, wet forests of the Otways. There's a few reasons we've chosen to work in these Foothill forests. The first is that geographical component. So these forests play a really important role in buffering and protecting the iconic wet forests of the Otways. And by managing the impacts of climate change in these forests, we can have a really significant contribution across the landscape. The second reason is the significant learning opportunity that these forests present, because a significant chunk of this land is forest park, which affords opportunities to trial and learn from new ways of managing forests that are perhaps harder on national parkland. And why now? Well, the first reason is fairly obvious: the pressing need to understand and respond to the increasing impacts of climate change. For this region, that will broadly look like increasing temperatures, long-term decline in rainfall, particularly in winter and spring, as Jack has just noted, and more extreme rainfall events. In very general terms, we might expect that by 2050, the climate here in Colac will more closely resemble Wodonga today. So what does that mean for our Foothill forests? Well, Australian forests and forest biota are all already facing many pressures such as drought, bushfires, introduced pests, and the ongoing impacts of human activities and past land uses, like logging. Climate change is rapidly exacerbating these challenges, driving changes in forest structure and further stressing ecosystem function. So there's a really urgent need for us to better understand how to manage forests and how do we adapt to these changing conditions. The second reason that this is an important moment for this type of work is the Victorian Government's decision to end native timber harvesting on the 1st of January this year. This has accelerated the government's efforts to develop a new policy framework to shape the state's public forests into the future. Now, as most of you will no doubt know, the Otways are some 20 years ahead of the game in this respect, with native timber harvesting ending in the mid-2000s. That means that the Foothill forests of the Otways are uniquely placed to explore the impacts of current forest management regimes in a post-timber harvesting world, and to address how alternative approaches might address the legacy of native timber harvesting and the growing threat of climate change. So it's an incredible opportunity. So that was a bit of background. Now on to the strategic planning. So what the heck are adaptation pathways and how do they help us with this? Well, the concept of adaptation pathways is intended to provide a framework for making decisions in a flexible and iterative way that allow us to adapt to changing circumstances in the future. And I'll walk you through it with a really sort of simple example. Let's think about a coastal community facing the impacts of sea level rise. In the past, this hasn't been a huge issue, so they've basically been doing nothing. That's how you see them coming in on the screen there. However, imagine we've reached a moment in time where sea level rise is starting to bite, and we're seeing that periodic flooding is beginning to occur. Continuing to do nothing basically takes us into this unsustainable space. So instead, they have to start considering alternative pathways. Maybe they could build a sea wall or try some nifty approach like restoring a wetland to store water. Over time, these pathways themselves may become unsustainable, so we have to think about more radical options. Maybe it's a bigger seawall or something even more transformative like coastal retreat. The Adaptation Pathways concept provides a framework for exploring these different options and to consider the conditions under which they might come into play. Now, to do this properly, we need a few things. We need to know our objectives, what we're trying to achieve, that's a desirable future. We need to know how the sustainable space might change over time as a result of social, environmental and climatic change. We need to know when we might need to change course in our management. So what are the triggers for change? We need to know what's on the menu of alternative management options and what their likely impacts will be. And finally, we need the adaptive capacity and social capital to enable us to actually change course. So simple as that. Now, that's tricky enough when we're talking about something relatively predictable like sea level rise and where we're managing for a comparatively simple outcome like asset protection. It's actually much harder, obviously, when we think about this in the context of complex dynamic forest ecosystems, where the impacts and interactions with climate change are less certain, and where we manage forests for a whole range of outcomes, biodiversity, bushfire risk reduction, recreation, and until very recently, timber production. Which is my way of explaining why I'm not going to be presenting the answer to all of this today at the end of this 12-month pilot, but I can tell you what we have been doing. The first thing has been a piece of work that Kay from the CEC has been leading, which is a document that started as a conventional literature review and evolved over time into something much broader that we're now just calling a knowledge review. And this includes an ecological profile of the Foothill forests, an overview of the likely impacts of climate change, a literature review on the impacts of management actions, interviews with a whole range of subject matter experts, and a stocktake of current management and monitoring that's going on in these forests today. Now, this review is intended to be a key reference document for the project and is helping us to store and share our understanding and to identify key knowledge gaps. But the intention is that this will, rather than collecting dust on a shelf, this will become a living document that will evolve as we learn. In parallel, a second key outcome of the pilot phase has been the formation of a resilient forest stakeholder group, representing perspectives from government agencies, traditional owners, ecologists, water corps, local community groups, and engaged individuals. Shout out to some of the folks in the room who have been part of that group. Working with an experienced facilitator, Jeff Brown, who's done a lot of work in this climate adaptation space, we have organised a series of stakeholder workshops to help shape the development of adaptation pathways for the foothill forests of the Otways. So our first workshop focused on sharing different perspectives about what we value in these forests and developing a shared vision for future management. In this particular activity, groups of stakeholders were asked to describe the current state of forests, then to work backwards to identify tipping points that led us to this point, and then they were asked to describe the characteristics of desirable and undesirable futures. In our second stakeholder workshop, the focus was on forest management, understanding what we do now and how this might change to improve forest health and resilience into the future. There was a significant focus on the role of planned burning, firewood production, pest, plant and animal management, broader catchment management, and tourism and recreation. We also spent some time thinking about indicators of forest health and resilience. What are the things that we can see, experience, and measure that tell us that we're moving in the right direction? The third and final workshop of this pilot phase of work is taking place this coming Friday, and will be focused on developing an action plan to shape our work into the next phase of the project over the next 12 months. In particular, we'll be looking at what are the mission critical activities that we need to start in the next 12 months to help us create these alternative adaptation pathways. Which are the people, processes and policies we need to engage with and influence in order to move forward along those pathways? How do we continue to work together and within our own organisations to keep this process of change moving forward? So just to give you some key learnings from the project, the first thing is that there was a really broad consensus that the way that we manage forests does need to change, and our current approach won't deliver the best outcomes for forest health and resilience into the future. We can and must do better. So what's needed to do that? Well, we need a place-based approach that places traditional owner obligations to country at its centre and integrates the value and knowledge of communities alongside scientists and land managers. Instead of our current siloed way of working, we need an approach that's holistic and landscape scale and cross-tenure. We need long-term planning that confronts the challenges of climate change and is iterative and flexible to allow us to shift pathways as needed. And we need this approach to be informed by evidence about what works. What are some of the key knowledge gaps we need to address in order for us to map out adaptation pathways for the foothill forests going forward? Well, firstly, there's some really significant gaps in the evidence around the impacts of alternative management approaches in these types of forests, particularly in terms of the impacts on structure, ecology, and bushfire risk. And there's some important gaps that we need to address in how we integrate the latest climate modelling into management planning. In particular, understanding how the potential interaction between climate change and novel management, how that will work, and that takes us into some uncharted waters. We need to identify suitable triggers and thresholds that would alert us to the need to change course. And finally, we need to start thinking about how we can better plan for inevitable major events like bushfires, particularly thinking about biodiversity responses there. A third key gap is around how we manage and monitor forests for a broader set of cultural and social values. In particular, how we can build things like culturally significant flora and fauna into the way that we monitor forest health into the future. And finally, we've identified a really clear need to introduce more diverse perspectives into this work as it moves forward, with a particular focus on younger generations that will be shaping the discussion into the future. So next steps. Well, the good news is we have funding to keep this work going for the next 12 months, and we're committed to making some significant progress around those knowledge gaps. Now, we don't know exactly what phase 2 is going to look like, because we're waiting on the outcomes of that workshop that's taking place on Friday. But there's a few things that we're committed to. First is to build social capital through ongoing engagement with the stakeholder group. And we hope to continue to shape and drive this work over the coming year. We'll also be scoping ways to broaden engagement to encompass other perspectives. Secondly, we'll be bringing together a number of threads into a research and monitoring framework, and this will include a standalone research project focused on the role of low-intensity, high-frequency fire in the northern ramps of the Otways. There'll be some scoping around other potential research opportunities, looking at the impacts of thinning or logging. And we'll be scoping out that disaster preparedness piece with a particular focus on regional biodiversity risk assessment in relation to bushfire. We'll also be putting together a long-term monitoring plan that builds on the significant work that DECA already do, and also incorporates the outcomes from the workshops. And finally, we'll continue to work closely with experts to build and broaden that evidence base to inform our decision-making, with the aim of further fleshing out these adaptation pathways for the foothills of the Otways going forward. That's it from me. I just want to thank our partners at DECA and EMAC and all the people in this room who've been part of shaping that project within the stakeholder group, and to all of you for listening. Thanks very much.